The shelter's doorbell jangled as Frank Sullivan pushed open the door, the harsh Georgia sun casting his tall frame in shadow against the linoleum floor. Jessica Wheeler looked up from her desk, preparing her usual spiel about puppies and adoption fees, but the words died in her throat when she saw his eyes haunted, determined, fixed on some private mission. "I want your most hated dog," Frank said, his voice carrying the graveled edge of a man who'd seen too much. "Not the cutest, not the friendliest. The one nobody wants." Jessica's pen stopped mid-signature. "Excuse me. The dog you've given up on. The one you figure nobody's ever gonna take home." Frank's weathered hands rested on the counter, steady despite the tremor in his voice. "That's the one I'm here for." The silence stretched between them like a living thing. "Mister, we're in the business of finding homes. Not—" "I know what you're thinking," Frank cut in. "That I'm some kind of thrill-seeker or worse. I'm not. I just want the dog that's waited the longest." Jessica studied him, then slowly nodded toward the back hallway. "Follow me. But I should warn you, there's a reason nobody wants him." Past the rows of hopeful barks and wagging tails, past the adoptable and the adorable, they stopped at the last kennel. The sign read, simply, "Shadow, not for public adoption." Inside, a German shepherd lay motionless on concrete, fur patched with scars, one ear partially missing. Unlike the other dogs, he didn't rise or bark, just watched them with eyes that had long ago stopped hoping. "Jesus," Frank whispered, "this is Shadow." Jessica said, 3 years here, 3 failed adoptions. Last owner needed 42 stitches. The dog's amber eyes met Frank's, and something passed between them, a recognition deeper than words. "I'll take him," Frank said. "You don't understand," Jessica protested. "This dog is dangerous." But Frank was already kneeling, palm extended toward the cage. Shadow stared, then slowly, impossibly, rose to his feet. He approached the bars, sniffed once, and then, to Jessica's astonishment, whimpered softly, ears flattened, and placed a single paw through the bars onto Frank's outstretched hand. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching. From now, let's continue with the story. Oak Ridge, Georgia was the kind of small town that appeared on postcards but rarely made the news. Its main street boasted brick storefronts with candy-colored awnings, a diner where everybody knew your name, and enough churches to ensure salvation was never more than a few blocks away. But beneath this Norman Rockwell veneer lurked the same problems, plaguing rural America: shuttered factories, an opioid crisis that nobody discussed openly, and a struggling economy that left places like the Oak Ridge Animal Shelter perpetually underfunded. The shelter itself sat on the town's outskirts, a converted warehouse with chain-link runs and a gravel parking lot that turned to dust in summer and mud in spring. A hand-painted sign proclaimed, "All God's creatures welcome," though the truth was more complicated, as resources dwindled and euthanasia rates climbed. Frank Sullivan had come to Oak Ridge 3 years ago, though few townsfolk knew him beyond nods at the grocery store. At 45, his military bearing remained evident in his posture, but something in his eyes suggested battles fought long after leaving Afghanistan. His modest rental house on Maple Lane held few decorations, save for a folded flag in a triangular case and a worn photograph of a soldier kneeling beside a military working dog. Shadow, as the shelter staff nervously called him, had arrived at the facility following a police raid on a property outside town limits. His intake photos showed a once powerful animal reduced to skin and bone, with scars that spoke of systematic cruelty. 3 adoption attempts had ended in disaster, cementing his reputation as the monster dog of Oak Ridge Shelter. Jessica Wheeler had managed the shelter for 8 years, her idealism weathered but intact. At 38, she'd learned to balance compassion with pragmatism, though Shadow's case tested those boundaries. She'd postponed his euthanasia twice, unable to reconcile the occasional gentleness she glimpsed with his unpredictable aggression. Martha Wilkins lived next door to Frank, her 72 years granting her the small-town privilege of speaking plainly. Her porch served as unofficial community center where she dispensed sweet tea and unvarnished wisdom in equal measure. Police Chief Robert Thompson believed in order above all else. He'd warned Frank about living alone with your thoughts when he first arrived in town, an offer of help that acknowledged the particular burden veterans carried home. And 8-year-old Lucas Bennett, with his gap-toothed smile and perpetually untied shoelaces, was simply a boy who loved dogs, blissfully unaware of the darkness that connected him to Shadow's past. Jessica's hands trembled slightly as she slid the stack of paperwork across the desk toward Frank. "These are liability waivers. This one acknowledges the dog's history of aggression. This one releases the shelter from responsibility for any incidents. And this is confirming you understand Shadow cannot be brought to public parks or events." Frank signed each without hesitation, his weathered hand steady and deliberate. Outside the office window, the Georgia summer pressed against the glass like a living thing, waves of heat distorting the parking lot beyond. "Mr. Sullivan, I have to ask why this dog? We have dozens that would make wonderful companions. Shadow has issues that may never resolve." Jessica's voice held genuine concern beneath its professional veneer. Frank looked up, his blue eyes meeting hers directly. "Sometimes the ones with issues are the ones that matter most." He didn't elaborate further, and Jessica didn't press. Something in his expression suggested questions would hit walls. "I'll get him ready," she said finally, gathering the signed forms. "Wait here." As Jessica disappeared down the corridor, Frank's composure slipped momentarily. He rubbed his left knee, an old injury that ached when rain was coming, and allowed his mind to drift back to the dust and heat of Kandahar province, to Axel, his Belgian Malinois partner, alerting to the IED seconds before it detonated, to the feeling of being thrown backward, and waking to learn that Axel had absorbed the worst of the blast. The memory came with its usual companion's guilt, grief, the phantom sensation of fur beneath his fingers. "You're making a mistake, son." The voice broke through Frank's thoughts. An elderly woman stood in the doorway, arms crossed over a floral blouse. Martha Wilkins fixed him with a gaze that had likely intimidated generations of Oak Ridge residents. "Mrs. Wilkins," Frank acknowledged with a slight nod. "Frank, didn't expect to see you here. Bertha at the diner mentioned you were coming to look at dogs. Should have known you'd pick the worst case they got." Martha settled into a chair without invitation, her arthritis making the movement deliberate. "That dog's hurt people." "So have I," Frank replied quietly. Martha studied him for a long moment, then unexpectedly softened. "You fixing to save each other?" Then, before Frank could answer, Jessica returned. Through the glass partition, Frank could see Shadow straining at the leash, his powerful body tense with fear or aggression, perhaps both. A muzzle covered his snout, and the scar tissue around his right eye twitched nervously. "Are you certain about this?" Jessica asked one final time. Frank stood, steadier now. "Yes, ma'am." Martha rose too, surprising them both. "I'll be witnessing this foolishness. Then somebody ought to—" The walk to the processing area was tense. Shadow pulled against the leash, a low growl building in his chest whenever they passed another kennel. The other dogs fell silent as he passed, pressing themselves against the backs of their enclosures. In the small room used for meet and greets, Jessica carefully secured Shadow's leash to a wall hook. "I'll remove the muzzle if you're comfortable with that. Stand very still. Speak softly, and don't make direct eye contact at first." Frank nodded, positioning himself on the floor, deliberately making himself lower than the dog. Martha watched from the doorway, her expression unreadable. When the muzzle came off, Shadow's lips pulled back slightly, revealing teeth that had known conflict. He stood rigidly, assessing Frank with an intelligence that belied the dangerous animal label. "Hey, buddy," Frank said softly. "Rough road." "Huh." Something in the tone, or perhaps the words themselves, made Shadow's ears twitch. He remained tense, but the growling subsided. "I knew a few like you," Frank continued, his voice a gentle rumble. "Trained for one purpose, then discarded when the purpose changed. Not fair. Is it—" Shadow took a hesitant step forward, nostrils flaring as he caught Frank's scent. His amber eyes held questions, calculations, the complex algebra of an animal deciding whether trust was possible or merely another path to pain. "I'm not going to hurt you," Frank promised, slowly extending his hand, palm up, on the floor between them. "Your choice." "Everything's your choice now." The room held its breath. Jessica shifted nervously by the door. Martha watched with narrowed eyes. Judgment suspended. Shadow approached Frank's hand with cautious steps. He sniffed once, twice, then looked directly into Frank's eyes. What passed between them was wordless, but profound, a recognition, perhaps, of matching wounds carried beneath different skins. Then, with a soft whimper that seemed to emerge from years of stored pain, Shadow lowered himself to the ground. His ears flattened against his skull, and a single tear tracked through the fur beneath his eye. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his right paw and placed it on Frank's outstretched hand. "Well, I'll be—" Martha whispered from the doorway. Jessica blinked rapidly, her professional detachment cracking. "I've never seen him do that with anyone." Frank remained still, accepting the weight of the paw as the covenant it was. "We'll figure it out together. Shadow," he murmured, "one day at a time." The paperwork completed, Frank led Shadow to his truck under the watchful eyes of shelter staff. The dog trembled at the sight of the vehicle, balking at the tailgate. "Never been good with trucks myself," Martha commented, appearing at Frank's elbow. She'd insisted on following them out, her old sedan purring in the lot. Might want to try the back seat instead. Frank nodded, opening the rear door instead. Shadow still hesitated, looking between Frank and the unfamiliar space. "Go on, now," Martha encouraged, surprising them both. "That man there's fought worse demons than yours, I expect." Whether it was her words or simply exhaustion. Shadow finally climbed into the back seat, immediately pressing himself against the far door, as distant as the space allowed. As Frank closed the door and turned to thank Jessica, he caught sight of Martha's expression, no longer skeptical, but thoughtful. "You coming by for coffee tomorrow?" she asked, though it sounded more like an instruction than a question. "That dog's gonna need community, same as you do." Frank nodded, suddenly grateful for the old woman's stubborn presence. "Yes, ma'am. We'll be there." As the truck pulled away from the shelter, Shadow watched through the window as the only home he'd known for 3 years receded into the distance. His future, uncertain but different, waited at the end of the drive with the man who had asked for the most unwanted dog in the shelter. Frank's modest rental house on Maple Street had never felt quite like home until the moment he guided Shadow through the front door. The German Shepherd entered cautiously, body low to the ground, nose working overtime to process the new environment. Frank stood back, giving the dog space to explore on his terms. "Place is yours to check out," he said quietly. "Nothing here's gonna hurt you." Shadow remained frozen in the entryway, amber eyes darting from corner to corner, mapping escape routes. The air conditioning hummed softly, cutting through the Georgia humidity that clung even to indoor spaces in July. Frank moved slowly to the kitchen, keeping his movements deliberate and predictable. "Got you some things," he explained, unpacking a bag from the pet store Jessica had recommended, a memory foam bed, stainless steel bowls, grain-free kibble that cost more per pound than Frank's own groceries. He arranged the items in the corner of the living room, creating a space that was distinctly Shadow's. That first night, Shadow refused to approach the bed, instead wedging himself behind the couch where he could watch both Frank and the front door. He wouldn't touch the kibble while Frank watched, wouldn't drink water until the house fell silent. Frank pretended not to notice, settling into his recliner with a paperback military history, occasionally reading passages aloud as if the dog were any other roommate. By morning, the food was gone, and Shadow had moved to a spot under the dining table, still defensive, but close enough to observe Frank making coffee. Progress, of a sort. The pattern continued through the first week. Shadow existed in Frank's periphery, never letting down his guard but gradually expanding his territory within the house. He wouldn't come when called, wouldn't accept treats from Frank's hand, and startled violently at sudden movements or sounds from the street. On the 5th day, while Shadow dozed fitfully in a patch of sunlight, Frank noticed something he'd missed before a series of small, circular scars partially hidden by fur along the dog's flank. Cigarette burns, unmistakable in their deliberate cruelty. Frank's jaw tightened, a cold anger settling in his chest. He'd seen enough combat to recognize torture when he encountered it. "Who did this to you, boy?" he murmured, not expecting an answer. Shadow's eyes snapped open at his voice, but instead of retreating, the dog held Frank's gaze for a long moment before looking away, a small surrender of fear. That evening, when Frank placed Shadow's dinner bowl on the floor and stepped back as usual, the dog surprised him by approaching while he was still present. Shadow paused, regarding Frank carefully, then lowered his head to eat, keeping one eye on the man standing 3 feet away. The simple act of trust felt monumental. The breakthrough came on the 7th day. Frank had dozed off in his recliner, a documentary about World War II playing softly on the television. He woke to a strange sensation, warm breath on his fingers. Shadow stood beside the chair, not touching him, but close enough that Frank could feel the heat radiating from his body. When their eyes met, Shadow didn't flinch away. Instead, after a moment's consideration, he placed his paw hesitantly on Frank's hand, just as he had at the shelter. "Hey there," Frank said softly, tears pricking unexpectedly behind his eyes. "Nice to finally meet you." Their quiet progress was interrupted the next morning by a sharp knock at the door. Shadow immediately retreated to his hiding spot, as Frank opened the door to find Chief Robert Thompson on his porch, uniform crisp despite the heat. "Morning, Frank," the chief said, eyes scanning past him into the house. "Heard you adopted that problem dog from the shelter." Frank straightened slightly, old military habits resurfacing. "Morning, Chief. Shadow's doing fine. Thanks for asking." Thompson's expression remained neutral, professional. "That animal has a history in this town, Frank. 3 people hospitalized. 1 child nearly lost an arm. With respect, Chief, I've read his file. Those incidents happened after severe provocation. A dangerous animal doesn't need much provocation." Thompson removed his hat, wiping sweat from his brow. "Look, I'm not here officially. Just want to make sure you understand what you've taken on. This isn't some PTSD therapy dog. This is an animal with issues." The words struck closer than Thompson likely realized. Frank felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the precursor to the nightmares that still woke him sweating and disoriented. After losing Axel, the military psychiatrists had used similar language about Frank himself. Issues was their polite term for the fractured pieces he'd brought home from Afghanistan. "Chief, I appreciate the concern," Frank said carefully. "But Shadow deserves a chance." Thompson sighed, replacing his hat. "Just be careful. That's all I'm asking." He turned to leave, then paused. "Town's watching. Frank, first incident. I'll have to take action." After the chief's cruiser pulled away, Frank closed the door and leaned against it, suddenly exhausted. From beneath the dining table, Shadow watched him with an intensity that suggested understanding. "Just you and me against the world?" "Huh," Frank said with a tired smile. That afternoon, while Shadow napped, Frank examined the worn collar Jessica had sent home with him. He'd been meaning to replace it with something less frayed, but now his fingers detected something unusual, a hard lump beneath the weathered leather. Curious. He gently worked the object free and found himself staring at a small metal tag, tarnished and bent but unmistakably military in origin. "What the hell?" he muttered, turning it over in his palm. The markings were partially worn away, but Frank could make out what appeared to be a service number and the letters USMC K9, a military working dog tag similar to the ones Axel had worn in Afghanistan. Frank's mind raced, pieces clicking into place. Shadow's intelligence, his responsiveness to certain commands, the way he positioned himself with tactical awareness in new environments. This wasn't just any abused dog. Shadow had once been like Axel, a trained military asset. The realization hit Frank like a physical blow. How had a Marine Corps dog ended up abandoned, abused? And eventually, in a small-town shelter, Frank's phone buzzed with a text from Martha. "Bringing over meatloaf. Dog probably hungry for real food. 6 p.m. He smiled despite himself at the old woman's presumption, then froze as his eyes caught a name partially visible on the tag. Handler Lieutenant M. Ben. The rest was worn away, but Frank's blood ran cold. He knew only one Lieutenant M in the K-9 training program, Michael Bennett, his former colleague and friend from handler school, who had left the service under murky circumstances after allegations of excessive force in training methods, the same Michael Bennett who now lived in Oak Ridge with his son, Lucas. Shadow had emerged from his nap and stood watching Frank, head tilted as if sensing his distress. For the first time, the dog approached unprompted, pressing his body against Frank's leg in a gesture unmistakably meant to comfort. "You've got secrets, don't you, boy?" Frank whispered, gently running his hand along Shadow's scarred back. "Don't worry, so do I." Outside, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the yard as Frank sat on his porch steps, turning the tag over and over in his hand. Shadow settled beside him, closer than he'd ever voluntarily been, watching the quiet street with alert eyes that held more history than anyone had suspected. 3 months passed in a rhythm of small victories and occasional setbacks. July's oppressive heat gave way to August thunderstorms that left Shadow trembling under Frank's bed. Then to September's gentler warmth that allowed longer walks through the quiet streets of Oak Ridge. Frank marked their progress not in grand transformations but in quiet moments, the first time Shadow wagged his tail at the sight of him returning home, the night the dog chose to sleep at the foot of Frank's bed rather than guarding the door, the morning Frank dropped a pan in the kitchen and Shadow startled but didn't flee. Frank kept a journal detailing Shadow's rehabilitation. Partly from habit, military life had instilled in him the discipline of documentation, and partly because Jessica had requested updates. Training log, he called it, though healing log might have been more accurate for them both. Day 37. Shadow approached neighbor's child today. No growling, a loud brief pat on the head before retreating. Progress. Day 49. Night terrors again. Woke shouting instead of hiding. S came to bedside, pressed against my leg until breathing normalized. First time he's approached during episode. Day 62. S alerted to delivery person before doorbell. Barked, but didn't growl. Protective rather than aggressive. Huge difference. These small triumphs existed alongside challenges. Shadow still cowered when strange men approached too quickly. He still bared his teeth at the sight of certain objects' chains, metal pipes. Once at a baseball bat a child carried down the street, and he refused to set foot in Frank's garage. A mystery Frank hadn't yet solved. Martha Wilkins became an unexpected ally in Shadow's rehabilitation. The elderly woman appeared on Frank's porch regularly, always with some transparent excuse. "Just had extra pot roast," or "These biscuits won't keep," and always with a small treat for Shadow carefully tucked in her pocket. "That dog's coming along?" she observed one evening as they sat on Frank's porch swing. Shadow lay at their feet, more relaxed than he'd been in public spaces before. Still got them wary eyes, but he's carrying his tail higher. Progress is slow, Frank admitted, watching a neighborhood kid ride past on a bicycle. Shadow tracked the movement but remained calm. Healing ain't never been a sprint, boy. Martha's weathered hand smoothed her dress over her knees. My Harold came back from Vietnam jumping at backfiring cars for 15 years, but he got better, inch by inch. Frank glanced at her, surprised by the personal revelation. Martha rarely spoke of her late husband. "You think dogs carry the same kind of scars?" he asked. Martha snorted softly. "All God's creatures remember pain, Frank. Difference is, dogs don't try to drown it in Jim Beam." She patted Shadow's head gently. "This one's doing his best with what life dealt him, same as you." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Chief Thompson's cruiser, pulling slowly to the curb. Shadow stiffened but remained in place, a soft growl building in his throat until Frank murmured, "Easy. Evening, Frank, Mrs. Wilkins." Thompson nodded respectfully to Martha before turning his attention to Shadow. "I see the beast is loose." Frank felt a flare of defensiveness. "He's on my property, Chief, and he's not a beast." Thompson held up a placating hand. "Just an observation. Actually came by to say I've been hearing good things. Jessica Wheeler mentioned he's been making progress." "He has," Frank confirmed, surprised by the olive branch. Thompson studied Shadow for a moment. "Town council's discussing the shelter situation next week. Funding issues. Jessica mentioned you might have thoughts on the matter." The Oak Ridge Animal Shelter's financial troubles weren't news to Frank. Jessica had been increasingly transparent about the challenges during his weekly check-ins, her usual optimism fraying at the edges. "I'll be there," Frank promised. "Shadow, too, if that's allowed." Thompson's eyebrows rose. "You sure that's wise? Council meetings can get heated. Lot of loud voices. He needs to experience normal situations. Can't stay in a bubble forever." Martha made a sound of approval beside him. "Dogs got to live in the world as it is. Robert Thompson, same as the rest of us." The chief looked like he might argue, then simply nodded. "Your call. Just keep him controlled." His eyes lingered on Shadow. Interesting tags on his collar. New ones. Frank tensed slightly. He'd replaced Shadow's worn collar but transferred the military tag to the new one, still turning over its implications in his mind. "Just his registration. Why? No reason?" Thompson shrugged. "See you at the meeting." He returned to his cruiser, Shadow watching his every move. After he'd gone, Martha fixed Frank with a shrewd look. "You're keeping secrets. Franklin Sullivan." Frank managed to smile. "Nothing interesting." "Martha?" "Mm-hmm." Her tone made it clear she didn't believe him. "That dog's got history written all over him. Same as you." Later that night, after Martha had gone home with promises to bring cobbler the next day, Frank sat at his kitchen table with Shadow's military tag and his laptop. The partial name Lieutenant M. Ben had haunted him for weeks. Michael Bennett had been more than just a colleague in Afghanistan. He'd been a friend, someone Frank had respected for his seemingly natural ability with the military working dogs. They'd lost touch after Bennett's sudden departure from the program, and Frank's own medical discharge following the IED incident. Finding Bennett in the same small Georgia town had seemed like coincidence at first, but Shadow's reaction to the man's name, a subtle stiffening whenever Frank mentioned it, suggested connections Frank was only beginning to unravel. His research had yielded disturbing fragments. After leaving the Marines, Bennett had worked briefly for a private military contractor that supplied explosive detection dogs. The company had been investigated for animal welfare violations, though nothing had been proven. Bennett's name appeared in a forum for military dog handlers, mentioned in a post about washout dogs disappearing from the program. Most disturbing was the gap in Shadow's history, the 2 years between his military service and his arrival at the Oak Ridge shelter. Jessica had provided what records they had. Shadow had been seized during a police raid on a property outside town limits, along with several other dogs showing signs of fighting or abuse. The property owner had claimed no knowledge of the animals, suggesting they'd been abandoned there. Frank rubbed his tired eyes, the familiar pressure of a headache building behind them. Shadow patted over and rested his chin on Frank's knee, a gesture of comfort the dog had recently begun offering when he sensed Frank's stress. "What happened to you, boy?" Frank murmured, scratching behind Shadow's ears. "And what does Bennett have to do with it?" The following day brought an unexpected encounter. Frank had begun taking Shadow to increasingly public places, carefully gauging his reactions and never pushing too far. Today they walked the path around Oak Ridge Lake, less busy on a weekday morning. Shadow trotted beside Frank, his leash slack, when a boy's voice called out, "Is that the monster dog?" Frank turned to see a small figure approaching a boy of about 8, with unruly brown hair and untied shoelaces. Despite the potentially offensive question, his expression held only curiosity. "This is Shadow," Frank corrected gently. "He's not a monster, just a dog who's had a hard time." The boy stopped a respectful distance away, studying Shadow with genuine interest. "My dad says he bit people." "He did," Frank acknowledged, seeing no benefit in lying. "But he was scared and hurt then. He's learning to trust again." Shadow watched the boy warily but showed no signs of aggression. His tail remained low but not tucked, cautious rather than fearful. "I'm Lucas," the boy offered. "Lucas Bennett. I live over on Willow Street." The name hit Frank like a physical blow. Bennett's son? He managed to keep his expression neutral. "Nice to meet you, Lucas. I'm Frank Sullivan." Lucas's eyes never left Shadow. "Can I pet him? I know about dogs." "You're supposed to let them smell your hand first." Frank hesitated. Shadow had made progress with adults but had limited exposure to children. The risk seemed significant, and yet the dog's body language remained calm, his attention on Lucas curious rather than threatened. "Let's try something," Frank suggested, kneeling beside Shadow. "Hold your hand out, palm down, and let him decide if he wants to come to you." Lucas nodded solemnly and followed the instruction, his small hand extended at Shadow's eye level. For a tense moment, Shadow remained motionless. Then, to Frank's amazement, the dog took a step forward and delicately sniffed the offered hand. His tail gave a single, tentative wag. "He likes me," Lucas whispered, awestruck. "Seems that way." Frank agreed, equally surprised. "You can try a small pat on his shoulder, not his head. Just yet." Lucas complied with the care of someone handling something precious. Shadow permitted the touch, then took a step back. Having reached his comfort limit, even this brief interaction represented monumental progress. "He's nice," Lucas declared. "Not a monster at all." "No," Frank agreed. "Just misunderstood." "Lucas!" A sharp voice cut through the moment. Frank looked up to see a man striding toward them, face tight with concern or anger, perhaps both. Michael Bennett had aged since Frank had last seen him, lines etched deeper around his eyes, hair receding slightly, but his military bearing remained unmistakable. "Get away from that dog," Bennett ordered his son, grabbing Lucas's shoulder and pulling him back. Shadow's reaction was immediate and disturbing. The dog froze, his entire body rigid, eyes fixed on Bennett. A low growl built in his chest, not the defensive warning he sometimes gave strangers, but something deeper, primal. "Easy, Shadow," Frank murmured, shortening the leash slightly. Bennett stared at Frank, recognition dawning slowly. "Sullivan, Frank Sullivan." "Hello, Michael." Frank kept his voice neutral, all too aware of Shadow's tension vibrating through the leash. "Been a long time." Bennett's eyes darted between Frank and Shadow, something unreadable crossing his features. "What are you doing with that dog?" "I adopted him from the shelter 3 months ago." "Dad." "He's nice," Lucas protested. "His name is Shadow." Bennett's hand tightened on his son's shoulder. "We need to go." "Lucas." To Frank, he added, "That animal's dangerous. Should have been put down after what happened." Frank felt Shadow trembling beside him, the dog's eyes never leaving Bennett. "He's been evaluated by professionals. He's making progress. Some things can't be fixed. Sullivan, you should know that better than most." Bennett's words carried a weight beyond their surface meaning. "Keep that animal away from my son." As Bennett pulled Lucas away, the boy looked back over his shoulder, offering a small wave that Frank returned. Shadow remained rigid until the pair disappeared around a bend in the path, only then releasing a shuddering breath that seemed almost human in its distress. The encounter left Frank deeply unsettled. Shadow's extreme reaction to Bennett confirmed his suspicions that the two had history, violent history, judging by the dog's response. And Bennett's parting comment had carried unmistakable warning. That night, Frank experienced his first severe PTSD episode in months. The nightmare gripped him with familiar terror: the Afghan road, the IED, Axel's body thrown by the blast. But this time, new elements intruded Shadow in a metal cage. Bennett standing over him with a shock collar, Lucas crying in the background. He woke gasping, sheets soaked with sweat, to find Shadow pressed against him, the dog's weight a solid anchor to reality. For the first time. Shadow licked Frank's hand, a gesture so normal for a dog but so extraordinary for this one, that Frank felt tears form. "We're quite the pair, aren't we?" he whispered into the darkness. The town council meeting the following week marked a turning point. Frank arrived early, giving Shadow time to acclimate to the municipal building before crowds arrived. They took seats near the back, close to an exit in case retreat became necessary. Jessica spotted them and hurried over, looking both nervous and grateful. "I wasn't sure you'd really bring him," she admitted, keeping her voice low. "How's he doing in crowds now?" "We're working on it," Frank replied, as Shadow sat alertly beside his chair, watching the room fill. "He's come a long way." Jessica nodded, then hesitated. "Frank, I should warn you Michael Bennett is on the council, budget committee." The information shouldn't have surprised him, yet Frank felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. "I didn't know. He's been vocal about cutting the shelter's funding. Claims we're wasting resources on lost causes." Jessica's expression hardened slightly. "I'm hoping Shadow's progress might change some minds." The meeting proceeded with the tedious efficiency of small-town governance minutes approved, old business addressed, committee reports delivered. Shadow remained surprisingly calm beside Frank, occasionally scanning the room but showing none of the anxiety Frank had feared. Several council members glanced their way, but no one objected to the dog's presence. When the shelter's funding came up for discussion, Bennett took the floor, his presentation coolly professional. "The Oak Ridge Animal Shelter currently consumes 8% of our community resources budget. Their adoption rates are below state average, and their rehabilitation costs for aggressive animals are particularly concerning." From her seat near the front, Jessica stiffened visibly. "I'm proposing a 30% reduction in their annual allocation," Bennett continued, "with the recommendation that they focus resources on adoptable animals rather than rehabilitation cases with minimal chances of successful placement." The council chamber filled with murmurs, some supportive, others clearly opposed. Frank felt a familiar anger building, the kind he'd worked hard to control since returning from Afghanistan. "Any public comment on this matter?" the council chair asked. Before Frank could rise, Martha Wilkins was on her feet, commanding the room despite her diminutive stature. "I'd like to speak to this foolishness," she announced, ignoring the chair's wince at her characterization. "Mrs. Wilkins, you have the floor. 3 minutes. Please." Martha made her way to the podium with deliberate steps. "I've lived in Oak Ridge for 72 years, which means I've watched most of you grow up, including you, Michael Bennett." She fixed Bennett with a stern look that made him shift uncomfortably. "And I know the difference between economics and excuses," she gestured toward Frank and Shadow. "That dog there was what you'd call a lost cause. Dangerous. They said unadoptable. But look at him now, sitting there calm as can be in a room full of strangers, because someone took the time to see him as worth saving." The room had fallen silent, all eyes on Shadow, who remained settled beside Frank's chair. "This town's always found money for what it values," Martha continued. "We found it for that ridiculous welcome sign Councilman Peters wanted. Found it for the fireworks display that scared half the county's dogs into next Tuesday. Seems to me we can find it for creatures that depend on our mercy." When Martha finished and returned to her seat, several other residents spoke in support of the shelter. Frank finally rose, Shadow at his side, and approached the podium. The dog moved with him confidently, showing none of the fear that had once defined him. "My name is Frank Sullivan," he began, acutely aware of Bennett's cold stare. 3 months ago, I adopted Shadow from the Oak Ridge shelter. I specifically asked for their most difficult case." Frank detailed Shadow's progress without minimizing the challenges. He explained the dog's military background, though he carefully avoided mentioning any connection to Bennett, whose face had gone rigid at the reference. "This dog was trained to serve his country," Frank concluded. "Then something went very wrong in his life. The shelter gave him a second chance when everyone else had given up. I'm asking you to make sure other animals get that same chance." As they returned to their seats, a small commotion at the chamber entrance caught Frank's attention. Lucas Bennett slipped into the room, clearly having arrived alone against his father's wishes. The boy gave Frank a small wave, his eyes bright with interest as they landed on Shadow. Bennett noticed his son's arrival and frowned, motioning for Lucas to leave. Instead, the boy made his way toward Frank and Shadow, ignoring his father's increasingly agitated gestures. "Can I sit with you and Shadow?" Lucas whispered, reaching Frank's row. "Dad never lets me have a dog." The simple statement carried implications that sent a chill through Frank. Before he could respond, Bennett was on his feet, striding toward them with barely contained anger. "Lucas, I told you to stay with Mrs. Cooper," he hissed, grabbing for his son's arm. Shadow's reaction was immediate. He moved between Lucas and Bennett, not growling but positioned protectively, his eyes fixed on Bennett's hands. The room fell silent, the tension palpable. "Shadow, easy," Frank said quietly, placing a calming hand on the dog's back. To everyone's surprise, Shadow obeyed instantly, though he remained watchful. The dog's disciplined response, clearly demonstrating his training, made an impression on the council members, several of whom exchanged meaningful glances. "Your dog seems to have an issue with me, Sullivan," Bennett said tightly. Frank met his gaze steadily. "Shadow has issues with certain behaviors, not people." The loaded statement hung in the air between them. Bennett's eyes narrowed, a flash of something fear-guilt crossing his features before he composed himself. "Lucas, we're leaving. Now." His tone left no room for argument. As Bennett led his reluctant son from the chamber, Shadow watched them go, his posture gradually relaxing once they were out of sight. The council chair, visibly uncomfortable with the tension, called for a vote on the shelter funding. To Jessica's visible relief, the proposed cuts were rejected 5-2, with Bennett and one ally in the minority. After the meeting, as attendees filtered out into the warm evening, Jessica approached Frank, her eyes bright with unshed tears of relief. "Thank you," she said simply. "Both of you." Martha joined them, her expression thoughtful as she watched Bennett's car pull away from the municipal building, Lucas's small face visible in the passenger window. "That man's got shadows that make your dog look positively sunny," she observed. "And that boy of his?" She shook her head slightly. "Reminds me of someone else who needed saving." Frank followed her gaze, a growing unease settling in his chest. Shadow stood beside him, watching the departing car with an intensity that spoke of unfinished business. The dog's journey from feared outcast to advocate had been remarkable, but Frank sensed they were approaching a crossroads that would test them both in ways they hadn't yet imagined. "One step at a time," he murmured, as much to himself as to Shadow. The German shepherd pressed against his leg in silent agreement, their shared past and uncertain future bound together by a trust that had been hard-won but was now unshakable. As they walked home through the quiet streets of Oak Ridge, Frank couldn't shake the feeling that Shadow's story and Bennett's role in it was building toward a reckoning that would change all their lives. The Oak Ridge Gazette's headline screamed from every storefront and coffee table in town, "Local boy missing search underway." Frank stared at the paper on his kitchen counter. the black-and-white photo of Lucas Bennett's gap-toothed smile seeming to look directly at him. The article detailed the basics. Lucas had last been seen walking home from Oak Ridge Elementary, just 3 blocks from his house. That had been yesterday afternoon, a full 24 hours, with no sign of him. Shadow sensed Frank's tension, pressing against his leg with a soft whine. The dog had been restless since dawn, pacing the house and pausing often at the windows, behavior Frank had attributed to the thunderstorms that had rolled through overnight. Now he wondered if it had been something more, some instinctive awareness of trouble. Frank's phone rang, startling them both. Martha's voice came through clear and urgent. "You seeing the news about the Bennett boy? Whole town's organizing search parties at the elementary school. Thought you might want to know." "I'll be there," Frank said, already reaching for his jacket despite the late October warmth. He hesitated, looking at Shadow. "Not sure if they'll want him involved. Seems to me a dog with military training might be useful about now," Martha replied. "Especially one with a connection to the boy." That connection, Shadow's unusual calm around Lucas, so different from his typical wariness of children, had puzzled Frank for weeks. Now it took on new significance. "We'll head over." The elementary school parking lot had transformed into a command center. Volunteers clustered around folding tables where maps were spread out, areas marked off in grid patterns. Chief Thompson stood at the center, assigning sectors to search teams, his usual measured demeanor replaced by focused urgency. "Frank," the chief acknowledged as they approached, his eyes dropping to Shadow. "Not sure this is the place for him right now." "He's got military search training," Frank said simply. "And he knows Lucas." Thompson looked skeptical. But Jessica Wheeler, who was helping organize volunteers, stepped forward. "Shadow's got a remarkable nose, Chief. I've seen military dogs find people days after they've gone missing." "This isn't Afghanistan," Thompson replied. "No," Frank agreed. "It's better terrain, better conditions, and a fresher trail. Give him a chance." The chief hesitated, then nodded toward where Michael Bennett stood with 2 officers, his face haggard with fear and lack of sleep. "It's not my call. The father should decide." Frank approached Bennett carefully, aware of the man's hostility toward Shadow. Bennett looked up, his expression hardening when he saw them. "What's he doing here?" Bennett demanded, gesturing at Shadow. "He can help," Frank said simply. "Military working dogs are trained for search and rescue. Shadow knows Lucas's scent." Bennett's laugh held no humor. "That animal is dangerous. I don't want him anywhere near this search." One of the officers, a younger man Frank didn't recognize, cleared his throat. "Sir, with respect, we've got K-9 units coming from the county, but they're still 2 hours out. If this dog has training—" "He doesn't," Bennett snapped. "He flunked out of the program. That's why he ended up where he did." The statement confirmed Frank's suspicions about Shadow's past, but he kept his expression neutral. "That's not true. His tag shows he completed training. Whatever happened after wasn't because he lacked ability." Bennett's face flushed with anger or fear, perhaps both. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Sullivan." "I know we're wasting time that Lucas doesn't have," Frank replied evenly. "Let Shadow try. If he can't track, we'll step aside." Something in Frank's tone, or perhaps the mention of his son's narrowing window of survival, broke through Bennett's resistance. "Fine," he said finally, "but I'm coming with you." They gathered what they needed, quickly: Lucas's jacket for the scent, water for Shadow, a first aid kit in case they found the boy injured. Chief Thompson insisted on sending an officer with them. Patrol Officer Wilson, a younger man who looked both nervous and determined. "We've covered the obvious areas," Thompson explained, indicating sections of the map already marked. "School, route home, parks, friends' houses. Nothing. You try the northeast quadrant, along Cripple Creek. It's rough terrain, but if the boy wandered that far, those woods would make it hard to spot him from the road." Shadow remained unusually focused as Frank presented Lucas's jacket, his nose working intently over the fabric. The dog's demeanor had shifted noticeably. Gone was the lingering wariness, replaced by alert purpose. This was what he had been trained for, Frank realized. Before whatever trauma had broken his trust, Shadow had been a working dog with a mission. "Find Lucas," Frank commanded, using the direct tone that Shadow responded to best. "Find him." They began at the last confirmed sighting, the corner of Maple and Pine, where a crossing guard remembered seeing Lucas walking alone. Shadow circled the area methodically, nose to the ground, then suddenly lifted his head and looked northeast with unmistakable intent. "He's got something," Frank said. Bennett watched skeptically as Shadow led them down Pine Street, past the row of small businesses that marked the edge of Oak Ridge's downtown. The dog moved with growing confidence, pausing occasionally to reconfirm the scent before proceeding. At the intersection with Riverdale Drive, Shadow hesitated for the first time, casting back and forth as if momentarily losing the trail. Frank gave him space to work, recognizing the dog's process from his military training. After a moment, Shadow regained the scent, but now he pulled them away from the road, toward an overgrown path that led to Cripple Creek. "Lucas knows he's not allowed near the creek," Bennett said, frowning, "especially after all the rain we've had." Officer Wilson keyed his radio. "Wilson to base. Shadow's leading us toward Cripple Creek via the old footpath off Riverdale. Request backup to spread out along the creek banks." As they followed the increasingly muddy trail, Frank noticed Shadow's behavior changing subtly. The dog's ears were fully erect now, his body language suggesting not just tracking but alertness to potential threats. Twice he stopped suddenly, head swiveling to scan the dense undergrowth alongside the path. "What's he doing?" Bennett demanded during one such pause. "Checking his surroundings," Frank explained, watching Shadow carefully. "He was trained to assess for threats while tracking." "Threats?" Officer Wilson echoed, his hand drifting toward his holster. "You think someone has Lucas?" Frank chose his words carefully, aware of Bennett's growing agitation. "I think Shadow is picking up something beyond just Lucas's trail. Could be animal activity. Could be other people have been through here." They continued in tense silence, the dense woods closing around them as they moved farther from town. The creek came into view, swollen from recent rains, its usual gentle burble replaced by a more insistent rush. Shadow led them alongside it for nearly half a mile, then suddenly stopped, head high, nostrils flaring. "What is it, boy?" Frank asked quietly. Shadow whined, then lunged forward with renewed purpose, pulling Frank toward a bend in the creek where a tangle of fallen trees had created a natural dam. Beyond it stood an old structure, the remains of a pump house from when this area had supplied water to Oak Ridge decades ago. "Lucas!" Bennett shouted, rushing forward. "Lucas, are you here?" Shadow's reaction was immediate and alarming. He planted himself in front of Bennett, blocking his path, a low growl building in his chest. "Call off your dog, Sullivan," Bennett demanded, his face flushing with anger. Frank studied Shadow's posture, not aggressive but protective, preventing Bennett from rushing ahead. "He's telling us to be careful," Frank said. "Wilson, can you radio our position and request backup?" The young officer complied, describing their location as precisely as possible. "They're spreading teams along the creek. ETA about 15 minutes for the closest." Shadow remained tense, his attention divided between the pump house and Bennett, who was becoming increasingly agitated. "That's my son in there," Bennett insisted, trying to step around Shadow. "We don't know that yet," Frank replied, placing a restraining hand on Bennett's arm. "And if he is, rushing in might make things worse. Let Shadow check it first." Before Bennett could argue further, a sound froze them all in place, a child's faint cry, barely audible over the rush of the creek. Shadow's ears pricked forward, his body quivering with focused energy. "Lucas!" Bennett shouted again, breaking free from Frank's grip. Shadow darted ahead, reaching the pump house door seconds before Bennett. Instead of entering, the dog circled the small structure, nose working frantically along its perimeter. He stopped at a partially collapsed section of wall, pawing at the ground and whining with urgency. Frank joined him, scanning the area carefully. "There's something under here," he realized, dropping to his knees beside a section of rusted metal and rotted timber. "Looks like an old drainage access." Officer Wilson shone his flashlight into the gap Shadow had identified, revealing a narrow tunnel sloping downward. "Lucas," he called. "Lucas Bennett, are you down there?" A faint voice responded. "Help! I'm stuck. The water's coming in." Bennett lunged forward, already trying to force his way into the narrow opening. "I'm coming, Lucas." "Wait," Frank ordered, physically restraining the desperate father. "That tunnel could collapse. Wilson, radio for fire rescue. We need equipment. My son is down there." Bennett's voice cracked with fear and rage. "And we'll get him out," Frank promised. "But you won't help him by getting trapped yourself." Shadow was already methodically clearing debris from around the tunnel entrance, working with the focused precision of his training. Frank joined him, carefully removing rotted boards and rusted metal, while Officer Wilson relayed their situation to dispatch. Bennett finally channeled his panic into action, helping to widen the opening. "Lucas," Frank called into the darkness, "can you tell us how far in you are?" "I don't know," came the frightened reply. "I can't move my leg. Something fell on it." Frank made a quick decision. "I'm sending help. Lucas, my dog Shadow is coming to you." Bennett started to protest, but Frank cut him off. "Shadow can navigate that space better than any of us. He can reach Lucas and keep him calm until rescue arrives." After a moment's hesitation, Bennett nodded, desperation overriding his distrust. Frank knelt beside Shadow, holding the dog's gaze. "Find Lucas," he commanded. "Gentle, careful." Shadow needed no further instruction. He slipped into the narrow tunnel with practiced ease, his training evident in every movement. Frank watched until the dog's tail disappeared into the darkness, then turned to Bennett. "How did Lucas even know about this place?" he asked quietly. Bennett's expression shuddered. He explores. Kids do that. Kids do. This far from town, through dense woods, Frank pressed. Along a route that Shadow tracked directly, Bennett wouldn't meet his eyes. What are you implying, Sullivan? I think Lucas has been here before, Frank said carefully. And I think you know why. Their confrontation was interrupted by Wilson. Fire rescue's 10 minutes out. They're bringing collapse equipment and water pumps. From within the tunnel came a new sound, not Lucas's voice, but Shadow's distinctive bark. 3 sharp sounds followed by a pause, then repeated. Frank felt a chill run through him. What is it? Wilson asked, noting Frank's expression. That's a military working dog alert. Frank explained. It means he's found his target, but there's a complication. Shadow was trained to give that signal when he located an IED near a casualty. There's no bomb down there, Bennett snapped, though his face had gone pale. No, Frank agreed. But there's something else Shadow considers a threat. He moved back to the tunnel entrance. Lucas, can you hear me? Is Shadow with you? Yes. The boy's voice sounded stronger now. Relief evident even from a distance. He found me. He's keeping the water away. Frank and Bennett exchanged confused glances. What does he mean? Bennett demanded. The answer came in the form of a sudden gurgling rush from within the tunnel water, finding a new path through the old drainage system. The recent rains had evidently raised the creek level enough to begin flooding the underground network. The tunnel's flooding, Frank realized, already stripping off his jacket. We can't wait for rescue. Before anyone could stop him, Frank lowered himself into the narrow opening, guided by his flashlight. The passage was tight, but navigable, sloping downward at a gentle angle. About 30 feet in, it opened into a slightly wider chamber, an old inspection point in the drainage system. There he found Lucas, his leg pinned beneath a fallen section of concrete pipe, with Shadow pressed against him, physically holding back the rising water with his body. The sight stopped Frank cold. Shadow had positioned himself to create a dam with his own body, allowing Lucas to keep his head above the steadily rising water. The dog was shivering from the cold, but remained steadfastly in place, his eyes meeting Frank's with unmistakable determination. Hey, buddy, Frank said softly to Lucas, wading through the knee-deep water. Looks like you and Shadow are already acquainted. Lucas's face, pale with fear and cold, brightened slightly. He remembers me, the boy said, reaching out to touch Shadow's wet fur. From before. Frank began assessing the fallen pipe section, calculating how to free Lucas without causing a further collapse. From before? You mean from the lake? Lucas shook his head, wincing as the movement jostled his trapped leg. From when he lived with us, before Dad got mad at him. The simple statement confirmed what Frank had suspected, but hadn't been able to prove. Shadow hadn't just been trained by Bennett, he had lived with the Bennett family. The dog's unusual comfort with Lucas, his extreme reaction to Bennett, suddenly made perfect sense. Your dad never told me Shadow was your dog, Frank said carefully, working to shift the debris without further injuring Lucas. He wasn't supposed to be, Lucas admitted, his voice small. Dad brought him home to train him more, but Shadow didn't want to do the mean training. That's when Dad got really mad. Frank felt Shadow's eyes on him, the dog's gaze holding a depth of understanding that transcended species. Whatever mean training had entailed, it had clearly left scars deeper than the physical ones visible on Shadow's body. Outside, they could hear the arrival of rescue personnel, their voices carrying down into the flooded chamber. Frank called out their position, then turned back to Lucas. "Help's here now," he assured the boy. "We're going to get you out, and Shadow's not going anywhere, right, buddy?" Shadow responded by pressing closer to Lucas, still shielding him from the rising water, his loyalty to the boy untouched by whatever trauma had separated them. In that moment, as rescuers began threading equipment through the narrow tunnel, Frank understood with perfect clarity what Shadow had been trying to tell them all along, that sometimes the deepest bonds survive the worst betrayals, and that protection transcends fear. The next hour passed in a blur of coordinated rescue efforts. Fire personnel stabilized the tunnel, pumped out water, and carefully freed Lucas's trapped leg. Throughout it all, Shadow remained by the boy's side, moving only when necessary to allow rescuers access, his focus on Lucas unwavering. When they finally emerged into the fading afternoon light, Lucas on a backboard with Shadow, padding faithfully alongside, the gathered search teams broke into spontaneous applause. Chief Thompson approached, his expression a mix of relief and newfound respect as he looked at Shadow. "Never seen anything like it," one of the firefighters was saying. "That dog positioned himself like a trained lifeguard. Kid would have drowned otherwise." Bennett stood apart from the celebration, his face unreadable as he watched paramedics load his son into an ambulance. Shadow's eyes tracked Bennett's every movement, the dog's body language alert but no longer fearful, a guardian now, not a victim. As the ambulance prepared to depart for Oak Ridge General Hospital, Lucas called out weakly, "Can Shadow come, please?" The paramedic looked to Frank, who turned to Bennett. The moment hung between them, heavy with unspoken accusations and revelations. "He saved Lucas," Frank said simply. "Whatever happened before, he never stopped protecting your son." Something broke in Bennett's carefully maintained facade. "Fine," he said, his voice rough. "The dog can come. But this isn't over. Sullivan. Not by a long shot." As Frank and Shadow climbed into the ambulance beside Lucas's stretcher, Martha appeared at the edge of the gathering, having made her way to the scene despite the difficult terrain. Her eyes met Frank's, her expression knowing. "Told you that dog wasn't broken," she called, "just waiting for the right purpose." The ambulance doors closed on her words, sealing the three of them, man, dog, and child, in a moment of temporary safety. But Frank knew, as Shadow surely did, that the real storm was still gathering on the horizon. Lucas's rescue had exposed threads of a darker story, one that had begun long before Shadow arrived at the Oak Ridge shelter, and one that would not end until all its secrets were dragged into the light. The antiseptic smell of Oak Ridge General Hospital hung in the air as Frank sat in the waiting room, Shadow lying at his feet, against all hospital regulations. The German Shepherd had been allowed to remain partly due to Lucas's tearful insistence, partly due to Chief Thompson's unexpected intervention. "That dog's the reason we found the boy," Thompson had told the flustered hospital administrator. "He stays until we sort this out." 3 hours had passed since their arrival. Lucas had been whisked away for X-rays and treatment. His leg injured but not broken according to the preliminary assessment. Bennett had gone with him, throwing one last warning glance at Frank before disappearing through the double doors. Shadow hadn't moved from his position on the floor, his eyes fixed on those same doors, his body still damp from the creek water despite Frank's attempts to dry him with paper towels. The dog refused food or water, maintaining his vigilance with military precision. "You know what's happening, don't you?" Frank murmured, resting a hand on Shadow's scarred head. "You've been trying to tell me all along." Martha arrived with a thermos of coffee and a change of clothes for Frank, her usual plain-speaking manner subdued by the gravity of the situation. "Whole town's talking," she said, settling into the chair beside him. "Calling him the hero dog of Oak Ridge." Frank accepted the coffee gratefully. "He is." He positioned himself to keep Lucas's head above water. Could have drowned doing it. Martha's weathered hand reached down to stroke Shadow's fur. "Not the first time he's protected that boy, I'd wager." Frank looked at her sharply. "What do you know?" "Martha, I know Bennett was never right after coming back from overseas," she said carefully. "Know he's had complaints from neighbors about shouting. Know his wife left him 2 years ago, right around when this dog supposedly showed up at the shelter." She met Frank's gaze steadily. "And I know you've been putting pieces together since you found that military tag." Before Frank could respond, Jessica Wheeler hurried into the waiting room, her face taut with concern. "I came as soon as I heard," she said, kneeling to check Shadow for injuries. "Is he okay?" "Physically, yes," Frank answered. "But he won't leave, won't eat. It's like he's on duty." Jessica nodded, unsurprised. "I pulled his complete file after you found that tag. There were intake notes I hadn't seen before. The officer who brought him in suspected he might be a military dog because of how he responded to commands. But no one followed up." She lowered her voice. "Frank, the property where they found Shadow, it belonged to Bennett's brother-in-law." The revelation settled like a stone in Frank's stomach. Bennett was having his brother-in-law hide evidence of what he'd done to Shadow. "And possibly other dogs," Jessica added grimly. "There were 3 others found that day, all in terrible condition. 2 didn't make it." Shadow's ears pricked up as the treatment area doors swung open. Chief Thompson emerged, his expression grim as he approached their small group. "Sullivan," he acknowledged. "Mrs. Wilkins? Ms. Wheeler?" He glanced down at Shadow, who had risen to a sitting position, alert but calm. "The boy's going to be okay. Severe contusion and mild hypothermia, but no lasting damage." "Thank God," Martha murmured. "He's been talking," Thompson continued, his voice carefully neutral, telling quite a story about his father and certain training activities involving dogs. Frank felt Shadow press against his leg, a gesture that had become the dog's way of offering support. "What kind of activities?" Thompson glanced around the waiting room, then gestured toward a more private corner. Once they were relatively isolated, he continued in a lower voice. "Lucas says Bennett was training dogs for private security firms after leaving the military. Says his methods were extreme. According to the boy, Shadow was their household dog for several months until he bit Bennett during a training session. He was protecting Lucas, Frank guessed, the pieces falling into terrible alignment. Thompson nodded grimly. That's what the boy says. Claims Shadow intervened when Bennett was using excessive force with another dog in Lucas's presence. After that, Shadow disappeared. Bennett told Lucas the dog had been sent to a special facility. Jessica made a small, distressed sound. Instead, he was dumped at his brother-in-law's property to die. We don't know that for certain, Thompson cautioned, though his expression suggested he believed it. What we do know is that Lucas has described activities that could constitute animal cruelty, potentially at a criminal level, and child endangerment, Martha added sharply. Making a child witness that kind of cruelty is abuse in itself. Thompson didn't disagree. I've contacted Child Protective Services. They're sending someone to interview Lucas once he's stabilized. He turned to Frank. Bennett is demanding to speak with you. Alone. Frank felt a cold anger settling in his chest, the kind he hadn't experienced since his darkest days after Afghanistan. Where conference room down the hall? Officer Wilson's stationed outside. Thompson's hand brushed his sidearm unconsciously. I don't have grounds to arrest Bennett yet, but I've got my suspicions. Watch yourself. Frank nodded, then knelt beside Shadow. Stay with Martha, he instructed, using the command tone that Shadow responded to best. The dog whined softly, but settled beside the elderly woman, his eyes following Frank as he walked away. The small conference room was harshly lit by fluorescent tubes, casting Bennett's face in unflattering shadows as he paced the limited space. He stopped when Frank entered, his expression a complex mixture of anger, fear, and something like desperation. You've turned my son against me, Bennett accused without preamble. Frank closed the door behind him. Lucas did that himself when he told the truth about what happened to Shadow. Bennett's laugh was brittle. You have no idea what you're talking about. That dog was dangerous, unpredictable. He attacked me during a standard training exercise. Standard, Frank repeated. Is that what you call using shock collars on the highest setting, or forcing dogs to fight each other to build aggression? Your son described some interesting training methods. Michael. Something dangerous flashed in Bennett's eyes. Kids exaggerate. Lucas never understood the necessity of what I was doing. And what exactly was that? Frank took a step closer. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you were washing out military dogs through private channels, abusing them until they either broke or fought back, then disposing of the ones who didn't submit. Bennett's face flushed dark red. You self-righteous bastard! You have no idea what it takes to prepare dogs for the real world of private security. The military methods are too soft. They get dogs killed in actual combat situations. So you decided to create your own training program, Frank concluded, the final pieces clicking into place. Using military dogs you somehow acquired after they finished official training. That's why Shadow had tags but no record of discharge from service. I was doing important work, Bennett insisted, his voice rising. These firms need dogs that won't hesitate, that will engage threats immediately. The standard training produces dogs that wait for commands when they should be acting. Frank thought of Shadow positioning himself to hold back the rising water, protecting Lucas without hesitation or command. Seems to me the standard training worked just fine. Shadow remembered his protection duties even after everything you did to him. Bennett slammed his hand on the conference table. That dog turned on his handler. He was supposed to be put down. He wasn't protecting himself, Frank said. The truth suddenly crystal clear. He was protecting Lucas from you. That's why you really got rid of him. Not because he bit you, but because he chose your son over you. The accusation hung in the air between them. Bennett's hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, his breathing ragged. You don't know what you're talking about. I think I do, Frank replied quietly. I think Shadow recognized something in Lucas yesterday at the lake. I think he knew exactly who he was protecting in that tunnel, and I think you were afraid of what he might communicate to your son if they spent time together. Bennett's face had gone eerily calm, a stillness that Frank recognized from volatile situations in combat. You have a vivid imagination, Sullivan. What I see is a man projecting his own issues onto a situation he doesn't understand. You lost your dog in Afghanistan, so you've invented this heroic narrative about a washout mutt to make yourself feel better. Frank refused to rise to the bait. Chief Thompson is talking to CPS. Lucas's medical examination will show a pattern of bruising that suggests this isn't the first time he's been injured. And I'm betting when they search your property, they'll find evidence of your training program. They won't find anything, Bennett said with cold confidence. And a traumatized 8-year-old story won't hold up against my reputation in this community. Maybe not, Frank acknowledged. But Shadow's evidence will... Bennett's facade cracked slightly. What are you talking about? It's a dog, for Christ's sake. A dog with military training and physical evidence of systematic abuse. A dog who specifically reacts to you with fear and aggression. A dog who recognized and protected your son despite everything you did to separate them. Frank leaned forward. Dogs don't lie. Michael. And Shadow's body tells a story that any good veterinary forensic specialist will be able to read like a book. The color drained from Bennett's face. You can't. I already have. Frank interrupted. Jessica called in a specialist from the State University while you were with Lucas. Shadow's scars, his specific reactions, his training responses, they're documenting everything right now. It was a bluff. Jessica had done no such thing, but Frank could see from Bennett's reaction that he'd struck a nerve. The man sank into a chair, suddenly looking much older. You don't understand, Bennett muttered, more to himself than to Frank. I was trying to make things better, make them stronger. By breaking them, Frank asked quietly. That's not training. Michael, that's torture. Before Bennett could respond, a commotion erupted in the hallway, raised voices, the sound of running feet, and beneath it all, a familiar bark that sent Frank rushing to the door. Officer Wilson stood outside, his expression alarmed. It's the boy, he explained as Frank emerged. He's having some kind of panic attack. The dog somehow knew, broke away from the old lady and ran to his room. Frank hurried down the corridor, Bennett close behind him. They reached Lucas's room to find medical staff clustered around the bed, where the boy was thrashing against restraints, his heart monitor beeping erratically. Shadow had somehow positioned himself beside the bed, his muzzle resting near Lucas's hand, his presence drawing the boy's focus. You need to remove that animal immediately, a doctor ordered, pointing at Shadow. Wait, Frank urged, noting how Lucas had begun to calm at Shadow's touch. He's helping. The medical team watched in astonishment as Lucas's breathing steadied, his hand finding Shadow's fur. The dog remained perfectly still, his eyes never leaving the boy's face. "His vitals are stabilizing," a nurse reported, checking the monitors. "I've never seen anything like it." Bennett stood in the doorway, his face a mask of conflicting emotions as he watched his son being comforted by the dog he had discarded. For a moment, something like shame crossed his features before hardening into resolve. "This doesn't change anything," he said quietly to Frank. "Lucas is my son." Frank met his gaze steadily. "And Shadow was his dog. You took that from him once. Are you really going to do it again?" The question hung unanswered as a woman in a tailored suit appeared behind Bennett, her ID badge identifying her as Child Protective Services. Her eyes took in the scene: the boy, the dog, the father standing apart, and Frank knew with certainty that Shadow's journey had reached a critical turning point, one that would determine not just his future but Lucas's as well. 3 days after Lucas's rescue, Oak Ridge was gripped by developments that transformed what had begun as a heartwarming story of a heroic dog into something far darker. The Oak Ridge Gazette ran a front-page headline that sent shockwaves through the small community: "Local businessman under investigation, allegations of animal cruelty and child endangerment." Frank sat at his kitchen table reading the article, which carefully avoided naming Bennett directly but contained enough details that everyone in town would know exactly who was involved. Shadow lay at his feet, more relaxed than Frank had ever seen him, as if a great weight had been lifted from the dog's powerful shoulders. The phone rang, Martha's voice coming through without preamble when Frank answered. "You seen the paper towns buzzing like a hornet's nest?" "I've seen it," Frank confirmed, watching Shadow's ears prick up at Martha's familiar voice on the speaker. "CPS took temporary custody of the boy," Martha continued. "He's staying with his mother's sister over in Hartwell for now. Heard they're letting him have regular visits with that dog of yours." This was news to Frank. "Where'd you hear that?" "Bertha at the diner is cousins with a nurse at the hospital. Said they're calling it therapeutic animal interaction or some such. Apparently, the boy's been having nightmares something fierce unless that dog's around." Frank glanced at Shadow, who had lifted his head at the mention of Lucas, his intelligent eyes following the conversation with uncanny awareness. "Nobody's contacted me about visits." "Well, they will," Martha said with certainty. "Meanwhile, you might want to turn on Channel 6. They're doing a special report at noon, something about a bigger investigation." Frank thanked her and hung up, reaching for the remote. Shadow moved to sit beside him on the couch as the television flickered to life, showing a serious-faced reporter standing outside the Oak Ridge Police Department. Channel 6 has learned exclusively that what began as a local investigation into animal cruelty has expanded to include federal authorities, the reporter was saying. "Sources close to the investigation tell us that evidence seized from a property outside Oak Ridge has led to the discovery of what appears to be an illegal dog training operation with connections to private military contractors working overseas." The report continued, explaining in careful terms how military-trained dogs had allegedly been diverted into private hands and subjected to abusive training methods designed to increase aggression. No names were mentioned, but footage showed police tape surrounding a rural property that Frank recognized as belonging to Bennett's brother-in-law. A knock at the door interrupted the broadcast. Frank opened it to find Chief Thompson standing on his porch, his expression grave. "Mind if I come in?" the chief asked, his eyes moving past Frank to Shadow, who had approached to stand at Frank's side. Frank stepped back, allowing Thompson to enter. The chief removed his hat, turning it in his hands, a gesture Frank recognized as discomfort. "I'm guessing you've seen the news," Thompson began. Frank nodded. "Just now. Sounds like things have escalated." "That's putting it mildly." Thompson sank into a chair, suddenly looking tired. "FBI showed up yesterday. Turns out Bennett's training program wasn't just cruel, it was illegal. He was taking dogs that had washed out of military training or were being retired and running them through his own program, then selling them to private security firms operating in conflict zones." Frank felt a chill run through him. "How many dogs?" "At least 24 over the past 3 years, according to the records we've found so far." Thompson glanced at Shadow. "Your boy here was something different, though. He was fully trained, decorated even, had a distinguished service record." Shadow approached Thompson cautiously, sniffing the chief's extended hand before allowing a brief pat on his head, a level of trust he rarely showed strangers. "Bennett's brother-in-law is cooperating." Thompson continued. "Says Bennett brought Shadow to his property after the dog bit him during a corrections session. That's what Bennett called his training. Told him to get rid of the dog, but the brother-in-law couldn't bring himself to do it. Just left him there with some others, figuring someone would eventually find them." "Which they did," Frank said quietly, remembering Jessica's account of Shadow's arrival at the shelter. Thompson nodded. Animal Control responded to a complaint from a hiker. Found 4 dogs in bad shape, Shadow among them. He looked directly at Frank. "Here's where it gets complicated. The FBI wants Shadow." Frank stiffened. "What for?" "Evidence. Primarily. His physical condition, his training responses, his reactions to certain stimuli. It all builds their case." Thompson held up a hand as Frank began to protest. "I told them it's not that simple. The dogs bonded with you. And apparently with the Bennett boy, too. Lucas," Frank corrected automatically. "His name is Lucas." "Right. Lucas." Thompson sighed. "The kid's been asking for Shadow. His aunt called the station this morning. Said the child welfare folks think interaction with the dog might help Lucas open up about what he witnessed at his father's place." Frank looked at Shadow, who was watching them both with intelligent focus. "So, what happens now?" "Best case scenario. The FBI documents what they need from Shadow while he stays with you. Lucas gets supervised visits with the dog as part of his therapy. Bennett faces charges that keep him away from both of them for a very long time." Thompson replaced his hat, preparing to leave. "Worst case. This gets tied up in legal complications for months while a good dog and an innocent kid suffer." After Thompson departed, Frank sat on the porch steps with Shadow beside him, processing the morning's revelations. The dog leaned against him in what had become his characteristic gesture of support, as if sensing Frank's troubled thoughts. "You've had quite a journey, haven't you?" Frank murmured, running his hand along Shadow's scarred back. Military hero, family pet, discarded victim, shelter outcast, and now back to hero again. Shadow's response was to place his paw on Frank's hand. The gesture that had first connected them at the shelter now carrying the weight of all they'd been through together. The moment was interrupted by Jessica's car pulling into the driveway. She emerged looking both excited and apprehensive, clutching a folder to her chest. "You've heard?" she asked, joining them on the porch. Frank nodded. "Thompson just left. Said the FBI wants Shadow for their case." "It's more complicated than that," Jessica said, opening her folder. "I've been going through our intake records, trying to piece together Shadow's history. When the police raided Bennett's brother-in-law's property, they found 4 dogs, but our records only show 3 arriving at the shelter." Frank frowned. "What happened to the 4th? That's what I've been trying to figure out." Jessica showed him a photograph of 4 dogs being loaded into an animal control vehicle. One was clearly Shadow, his distinctive markings unmistakable despite his emaciated condition. The 4th dog was a female Belgian Malinois. According to these notes, she was pregnant. The information hit Frank like a physical blow. Bennett was breeding military dogs. Jessica nodded grimly. "The Malinois never made it to our shelter. She was diverted to a specialized rescue for pregnant dogs. She delivered 6 puppies a week later." She pulled out another photograph, this one showing a thin but beautiful Malinois with 6 tiny puppies. Her name was Cora. Frank noted the past tense with dread. "She died shortly after giving birth. The puppies survived and were adopted out through the rescue." Jessica hesitated, then added, "But here's where it gets strange. One of the puppies went missing from the rescue before formal adoption. Just disappeared one night." Frank felt Shadow press closer against his leg, as if the dog understood the significance of what they were discussing. "You think Bennett took it?" "I think someone did, and I think it might be why Bennett was so desperate to keep Lucas away from Shadow." Jessica met Frank's eyes directly. "What if Lucas knows what happened to that puppy?" The question hung in the air between them, adding yet another layer to the mystery surrounding Shadow's past and Bennett's actions. Frank looked down at Shadow, whose amber eyes held a depth of understanding that transcended species. "There's more to this story," Frank said quietly. "And I think Shadow has been trying to tell us all along." Jessica nodded, glancing toward the road as another vehicle approached a government sedan with official plates. "Looks like the FBI is here. Whatever Shadow knows, I think we're about to find out just how important it really is." As the sedan parked behind Jessica's car, Shadow rose to his feet, his posture alert but not fearful, for the first time since Frank had known him. The German shepherd carried himself with the confident bearing of what he truly was, not a broken shelter dog, but a decorated military veteran with a mission still to complete. Spring came early to Oak Ridge, carpeting the town in dogwood blossoms and the scent of renewal. 6 months had passed since the events at Cripple Creek. 6 months of testimonies and investigations, of headlines and whispered conversations at the diner. The story of the most hated dog in the shelter had transformed into something few could have imagined when Frank Sullivan first walked through those doors asking for the dog no one wanted. Frank stood on his front porch, watching Shadow and Lucas play in the yard. The boy's laughter, once so rare, now came easily as he tossed a ball for the German shepherd, who bounded after it with the fluid grace of an animal who had finally found peace. Shadow returned the ball, not dropping it directly in Lucas's hand as most trained dogs would, but placing it carefully at the boy's feet, a small gesture of respect that Frank had come to recognize as uniquely Shadow's. "Still can't believe how that dog moves," Martha observed from her rocking chair. At 72, She had appointed herself unofficial guardian of both boy and dog during the twice-weekly visits that had become the cornerstone of Lucas's recovery. "Hard to imagine he was that same scared creature you brought home last summer." Frank smiled, the expression coming more naturally these days. He just needed the right purpose. The legal proceedings against Michael Bennett had concluded 2 months earlier with a plea agreement that spared Lucas the trauma of testifying, but ensured his father would serve substantial time for animal cruelty, child endangerment, and fraud related to his illegal dog training operation. The FBI investigation had revealed connections to private security firms operating in global conflict zones, companies willing to pay premium prices for attack dogs trained beyond the ethical boundaries of military programs. Lucas now lived permanently with his aunt in Hartwell, just 30 minutes from Oak Ridge. The arrangement allowed him to maintain his school connections while establishing a stable home life away from the shadows of his father's actions. His aunt, Sarah Lawson, had initially been wary of Shadow, concerned that the dog might trigger traumatic memories for her nephew. Instead, she had discovered what Frank already knew, that Shadow possessed an almost supernatural ability to sense Lucas's emotional state, providing comfort and security when the boy's nightmares returned. "You ever think about what might have happened if you hadn't gone to that shelter that day?" Martha asked, her weathered hands working at the quilt in her lap, a wedding gift for her granddaughter. Frank watched as Shadow gently nudged Lucas's hand, encouraging the boy after he missed a throw. "I try not to think too much about what-ifs these days," he replied. "Learned that the hard way in Afghanistan." The mention of his military service came easier now, the sharp edges of those memories softened by time and by the healing that had come through helping Shadow. The nightmares hadn't disappeared entirely for either of them, but their frequency had diminished. On the rare nights when Frank woke shouting, Shadow was there, a solid presence grounding him to the present rather than the past. "Uncle Frank, watch this," Lucas called, using the title he had bestowed on Frank months ago. Despite the lack of actual relation, the boy gave a hand signal that Frank didn't recognize, and Shadow immediately dropped into a perfect play-dead position, rolling onto his back with his paws in the air. "That's a new one," Frank called back, impressed. "Where'd you learn that?" Lucas beamed with pride. "Shadow showed me. I think he remembers his old training." The casual comment reminded Frank of how far they had all come. The FBI investigation had ultimately unearthed Shadow's complete service record: 3 tours in Afghanistan, multiple commendations for detecting explosives, and a Purple Heart equivalent for injuries sustained in action. The dog had been declared unfit for further service after displaying what the military termed handler selectivity issues, a bureaucratic way of saying he had become wary of certain handlers, but not others. Instead of being honorably retired, Shadow had somehow been diverted into Bennett's program, one of several such cases that had prompted a full Pentagon review of the military working dog retirement process. The resulting scandal had made national news, with Shadow's story featured prominently as an example of the system's failures and ultimate redemption. Chief Thompson's cruiser pulled up to the curb, a familiar sight on these visitation days. The chief had taken a personal interest in Lucas's case, often stopping by to check on the boy's progress and, though he would never admit it, to see Shadow. "Afternoon, folks," Thompson greeted, climbing the porch steps with an envelope in his hand. "Got something for you. Sullivan?" Frank accepted the envelope with a questioning look. "What's this official paperwork from the Department of Defense?" Thompson replied, settling into an empty chair. Shadow's been formally recognized for his military service. Comes with a stipend for his care and medical needs for life. The news shouldn't have been surprising. Jessica had been working with veterans organizations to secure this recognition for months, but Frank felt a swell of emotion nonetheless. "About time they did right by him," Martha snorted softly. "Government always takes its sweet time doing the obvious." Thompson smiled at her bluntness. "There's more. The FBI's case wrapped up this morning with the final indictments. 7 people connected to Bennett's operation, including 2 overseas contractors. You and Shadow are officially released from any further obligations to the investigation." The significance of this announcement wasn't lost on Frank. For months, Shadow had been technically classified as evidence, his adoption status contingent on the case's resolution. Now, finally, there were no more legal complications, no more uncertainties about his future. "That mean what I think it means?" Frank asked, glancing toward Lucas, who was now sitting in the grass with his arm draped over Shadow's back, whispering something in the dog's ear. Thompson nodded. "You're free to make permanent arrangements." Speaking of which, he gestured toward an SUV that had just parked behind his cruiser. Sarah Lawson emerged, waving as she approached the porch. "Sorry I'm late," she called. "Parent-teacher conference ran long." Lucas spotted his aunt and ran to greet her, Shadow trotting faithfully at his side. The transformation in the boy over the past months had been remarkable, from the frightened, withdrawn child of the hospital to this smiling, increasingly confident young person. Much of the credit belonged to the therapy he'd received, but Frank knew that Shadow's unwavering support had played an equally crucial role. "We were just discussing Shadow's official status," Thompson explained as Sarah joined them on the porch. "Now that the case is closed, some decisions can be made about permanent arrangements." Sarah nodded, her expression turning serious. "That's actually why I wanted to talk to you today. Frank, Lucas and I have been discussing something important." She glanced down at her nephew, who had returned to the porch steps with Shadow beside him. "Do you want to ask, or should I?" Lucas straightened, gathering his courage. "Uncle Frank, Aunt Sarah said we might be able to adopt Shadow. Not take him away from you," he added quickly. "But maybe share him. He could live with you most of the time, but stay with us sometimes too. Like," he searched for the right words, "like joint custody." The simple question carried the weight of all they had been through together: the fear, the healing, the bonds forged through trauma and recovery. Frank looked at Shadow, whose intelligent eyes moved between him and Lucas, a living bridge between 2 wounded souls. "I think that sounds perfect," Frank said, his voice rough with emotion. "Shadow's smart enough to handle having 2 homes, especially when both of them love him." The relief and joy on Lucas's face was answer enough. The boy threw his arms around Shadow's neck, burying his face in the dog's fur. Shadow responded by placing his paw gently on Lucas's arm, the same gesture of connection he had first offered Frank at the shelter, now extended to another soul in need of healing. As the adults discussed logistics weekends, holidays, transportation arrangements, Frank watched Shadow and Lucas together, marveling at the journey that had brought them all to this moment. The dog that no one had wanted had become the center of a new kind of family, one formed not by blood but by shared experience, mutual healing, and the extraordinary capacity for forgiveness that seemed to be Shadow's greatest gift. Martha, ever observant, leaned closer to Frank. "You know what they say," she murmured. "The Lord works in mysterious ways." Frank nodded, watching as Shadow, once the most feared and rejected animal in Oak Ridge, gently licked away a tear of happiness from Lucas's cheek. "Some mysteries," he replied softly, "turn out to be blessings in disguise." As the afternoon light cast long shadows across the yard, the most hated dog from the shelter lay contentedly between the two humans he had saved in different ways, a living testament to the resilience of the spirit and the healing power of second chances. Sometimes it's the souls others have given up on that have the most to give. Remember when life was simpler, when we believed in second chances and redemption. Shadow's journey from the most unwanted dog at the shelter to a hero who saved a child's life reminds us that value isn't always visible on the surface. Like many of us who've weathered life's storms, carrying scars both seen and unseen, Shadow needed someone to look past his broken exterior to recognize the loyal heart within. Frank Sullivan didn't see a dangerous animal, he saw a fellow warrior carrying battle wounds. Their story speaks to truths we've learned through our own decades of living, that healing comes through purpose, that family is formed through love rather than blood, and that sometimes the most profound connections occur between the most wounded souls, in a world that increasingly discards whatever seems damaged or difficult. Shadow and Frank's journey stands as a testament to the values our generation holds dear: loyalty, perseverance, and the unwavering belief that no one is beyond redemption. Remember, the most beautiful gardens often grow from the most neglected soil, and the most faithful hearts are often those that have known abandonment.